Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first Coase-Sandor Global Lecture Series. My name is Omri Ben Shachar, and I am the Kearney Director of the Coase-Sandor Institute. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this international event. We are expecting guests from over 40 countries today. Very exciting. I will first, before I introduce the lecture and our speaker, let me go over quick house rules very briefly. This meeting is being recorded. We ask that everyone turn off video and audio. Other than the speaker and the moderator, everyone please turn off video and audio. We do expect to have enough time for questions and answers in the second part of the lecture. At that point, if you're called upon, if you have a question and raise your blue hand, we will call on you and then you can turn on your audio and video for that purpose. Otherwise, please keep the display in speaker mode and turn off the audio and video. We are having one small glitch as we do this for the first time. Our moderator, Professor Chin Dai from Peking University, has not been able to join as a panelist yet. We are looking for him in over 300 participants right now. If he manages to pop out, we will call upon him to moderate the meeting. But in the meantime, without further ado, let me begin this lecture. This is an initiative of the Coase-Sandor Institute that has, for the past 10 years, hosted what we call the Summer Institute. Many of the participants today came to Chicago for a 2-week session in advanced law and economics and took it back with them to their institutions. This year, obviously, we were unable to do this institute. And instead, a little bit at the end of perhaps at the end of the summer, it is already fall out here in Chicago. We decided to go online with a series of events. One of them is this 5-lecture series that will take place on Mondays and Thursdays in the next 2 weeks. Today's speaker, today's series, the first of these series of these lectures is, we start with the best. We have a fantastic lecture by my colleague, Professor Lior Strahilevitz, a world expert in so many areas: privacy, market regulation, property, and a person that many of you have met in your prior visits to Chicago. Also, notably, probably the best lecturer that we can offer, and a very popular teacher and scholar here in Chicago. Professor Strahilevitz will examine today the phenomenon that he has discovered to be very disruptive and very meaningful in online consumer transactions, which is known as dark patterns. Without further ado, I will now give the podium to Professor Lior Strahilevitz.
Thank you so much, Omri, for that very generous, too generous introduction. I'm always aware that when people describe someone as an expert in so many things, what they really mean is an expert in nothing. But I will try and show you some interesting new data and expose you to some ideas that some of you will be familiar with, some of you won't be familiar with, in a very hot topic, I think, for law and for consumer protection. It's really a joy to be able to be with you all over the continents, all over the world. It looks like we now have 330 participants, which is terrific, and we wish we could all be together in person. But we know that if we were in person, we wouldn't be able to talk with so many of you and to hear your questions. So I'm going to shift over to some slides. Hopefully everybody's seeing them. This will be work that I'm talking about today that I had the great joy of co-authoring with my former student, Jamie Liguri, who's a JD PhD psychologist. and she's presently clerking here in Chicago for a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. So without further ado, let me tell you about dark patterns. Definitions are helpful. Dark patterns is a term that Harry Brignall, a user experience designer in the United Kingdom, developed about a decade ago. And he developed the idea of dark patterns sort of in reaction to a number of different manipulative techniques that he saw online with user interfaces. And, sort of based on Brignall's definition and his working set of examples, we can identify a dark pattern as a manipulative user interface that, rather than persuading users to change their preferences, manages to thwart those user preferences and overcome a consumer's will. And typically what these dark patterns do is they tend to divert consumers away from deliberative system 2 decision-making towards more impulsive system 1 decision-making. And this is generally done either to convince a consumer to buy a good or a service, or to surrender personal information that they would otherwise prefer to keep private. Many of you will be familiar with Thaler and Sunstein's work on nudge. They've developed an idea called sludge, which is basically evil nudges. And one way to understand dark patterns, if you're familiar with their work on nudges, is kind of an evil or a malicious nudge that's trying to get the consumer to do something that the consumer doesn't want or that's not in the consumer's best interest. So what I want to take a few minutes doing is show you some examples of dark patterns as they actually exist on the global internet. And after showing you the examples, I'll dive right in to our research that tries to examine how these dark patterns do or do not overcome consumer preferences. So one very common form of dark pattern is the intentionally confusing user interface like this one, which I think presents a real problem for a consumer who's trying to figure out which of these two buttons they ought to press if they're interested in canceling the service in question. A common form of dark pattern is what we call obstruction, imposing needless obstacles in the path of what the consumer would like to do. This is a screenshot from Sony's PlayStation Plus, a very popular online gaming platform. And by default, PlayStation Plus will sign you up for a monthly subscription that renews every month. They're happy to let you opt out of automatic renewal, provided, and you can see this at the bottom of the slide, that you go first to settings, and then to account management, and then to account information, and then to wallet, and then to purchase settings. They don't tell you that along the way they're going to require you to re-authenticate with your login credentials. I did this, and it took me about 10 minutes, and I was only able to do it because I took out my camera phone and took a picture of the 5 different steps I was going to have to jump through, many of which are counterintuitive. So Sony is allowing you to exercise your option of opting out of automatic monthly renewal, but they're making it very difficult, and they know that some people who would like to only be billed with a monthly renewal option aren't going to be able to do so. This is an example of what Brignall called confirm shaming. It's an effort to use psychologically loaded language in a way that makes the consumer feel bad about exercising the option that they're inclined to exercise. So this is a screen from a food vending machine, actually on the University of Chicago campus. And what the company would like to do is gather people's cell phones so they can perhaps use them for marketing or analytical purposes, And so at the conclusion of the transaction, they're asking you to enter your cell phone number so that you can sign up for their frequent diners program. And in bright green letters, they say you can earn greens, which means sign up for the frequent eater program, or in a less attractive green font on white, no thanks, deals aren't my thing. In other words, no thanks, I'd rather not save 5% or get 5% back every time I purchase a sandwich or a salad. The dominant platform for buying and selling tickets in the United States is called Ticketmaster. And Ticketmaster employs really a large variety of techniques that are dark patterns, and I can show you on the Ticketmaster website kind of the potent combination of these dark patterns. So this is a screen from when I purchased a ticket to an event here in Chicago, and I'll highlight several aspects of what Ticketmaster is doing. Ticketmaster would very much like, after selling me a ticket to an event, to sell me event insurance. What happens if you're sick that day and can't go to the event? Now, these tickets only cost, I think, $25, $20. So the idea of insuring against cancellation seems like a little bit of a joke to begin with, and it's clearly a way in which Ticketmaster makes money by charging a premium for this event cancellation insurance. And so several of the dark pattern techniques are showing up on this screen where they're pushing the cancellation insurance. One is that yes is in green, no isn't. But beyond that, they're telling you that purchase of the insurance is highly recommended. Highly recommended by whom? Well, by Ticketmaster. But I think a lot of consumers won't think that all the way through. They're also doing a lot of what's called social proof. They're telling me that another Ticketmaster customer just purchased the same insurance product a minute ago. In fact, in the last 7 days, more than 93,000 people have purchased the product, including Tanya H. from Alpharetta, Georgia, who would never attend an event without the insurance again. There's a really interesting research by Arunesh Mathur and a number of co-authors that actually scrapes the code for a lot of popular e-commerce sites and finds that a lot of this information, 93,829, Tanya H., Alpharetta, Georgia, is the code can show you going to be at a number of e-commerce sites generated by random number generators and random name generators. In other words, they're trying to create a bandwagon effect, and they're not even using real statistics or real testimonials to do so, because it's easier to go with fakes. Well, once I made it through those screens and rejected the insurance product, Ticketmaster is going to continue trying to sell me things. In this instance, they want to try and sell me a subscription to a razor blade program. Again, you're noticing the visual contrast between the attractive blue sign me up and the unattractive no thanks. But there's other forms of visual interference that are operating here too. So I've highlighted in a red box this language towards the bottom, which says there's actually a way to click through to avoid being shown 4 different additional ads about stuff you can buy that Ticketmaster will earn referral fees on. But we're going to make that font much lighter in comparison to the font of the offer, in the hopes that you won't see that you can skip through these additional ads. And then once you've made it through all of that, Ticketmaster is going to employ a technique called nagging. And I'll highlight the relevant text here. Notice the choice. So Ticketmaster would like to send push notifications to my smartphone, but they're giving me a choice. I can either agree to push notifications, or I can select maybe later. And what happens if I select maybe later? Well, if I select maybe later, a week later, they'll again give me a choice between okay and maybe later. Until eventually, and they'll keep doing this every week until I eventually relent and permit them to send me push notifications. And notice the asymmetric nature of the choice. It's a choice not between yes and no, but between yes and ask me again. Okay, this is by design, and I'll show you some data in a little bit suggesting that this is one of the most powerful dark patterns that companies employ. By the way, if you suggest okay, they're not going to ask you a week later to revisit that choice. Once you select yes, once you do what the company would prefer that you do, then the nagging obviously will stop. So there's here's an effort, and there's a lot going on this text to identify what previous scholars have developed by way of a taxonomy of dark patterns. I think I saw maybe Colin Gray participant, so hello, Colin. Colin's done fantastic work on dark pattern taxonomies. So it's a pleasure to have him in the discussion today. And scholars like Mathur, Brignall, Bosch have done really nice work. I've shown you some of the dark patterns, but I've not shown you every dark pattern. And there's a nice literature. You can look at Gray's work, you can look at Mathur's work and other work if you're interested in learning more. So one of the papers that I identified earlier is this one on the right by a team of computer scientists at Princeton and the University of Chicago, where they've gone through in a really clever automated way and scraped leading e-commerce websites and are viewing the proliferation of dark patterns. There's a newer paper by Midas Nguyen's and a team of other researchers that does the same thing in Europe and finds, actually notwithstanding GDPR and other relevant regulations, that dark patterns are quite widespread in European e-commerce. But before Jamie and I began this research, there wasn't yet a team of researchers that had actually gone through in a systematic way and tried to identify the effectiveness of dark pattern techniques in molding consumer behavior. And so that's what we set out to do. So we conducted two very large-scale experiments. I'll talk first about experiment 1 and then experiment 2, which is really hot off the presses. This will actually be the first time that anyone outside of Jamie and I and our editors are seeing some of this new data from our second experiment into dark patterns. So we began though with experiment 1, and experiment 1 took about 15 minutes for our respondents to complete. We ran almost 2,000 ordinary Americans. It was census weighted, which means reflective of the overall US population in terms of age, race, region, gender, etc. And at first we asked them a number of questions about their own attitudes about privacy for about 10 minutes. And at the end of that period, we told everyone who had participated in the survey that we were calculating their privacy propensity score. And then after a brief delay, we said, based on your responses to the earlier question, you are someone who cares a lot about your privacy. And it turns out everyone thinks they care a lot about their privacy. We had collected a lot of demographic information from them, and we told them that to address their anxieties about privacy, we were going to sign them up for an identity theft and data protection plan. That plan would be free for the first 6 months. And then after 6 months, we would charge them a reasonable monthly fee of either $3 or $9 essentially a month, but they could cancel at any time. We then randomly assigned subjects to one of 3 conditions: a control group that I'll show you in a minute that would have had an easy time rejecting this data protection plan, a group that was exposed to a few dark patterns, and then a group that was potentially exposed to a lot of them. So these are the screens that our control group saw. We basically told them about the special partnership that we had created with a very reputable data protection company, and we gave them a neutral choice between accept or decline. Now, we did say we were already signing you up, so already we're slanting people a little bit in the direction of signing up for the service. But as we'll see, most people were not especially excited about accepting this offer. After they made a decision here, we asked them a series of questions about their mood, about how willing they would be to do research with the same researchers in the future, and then we asked some filler questions. Okay, what did the mild dark pattern condition look like? This is another third of the sample randomly selected. Well, here you're seeing that we used some of the same tools that Ticketmaster uses. Note the contrast between the bright red accept and the grayed out other options. Note that accept and continue is recommended. Other options isn't no, reject the program. It's signaling to the consumer you're going to have to do some additional work if you'd like to reject the offer. And if they did select other options, then they were just taken to this additional screen. They kind of gave them a second chance to accept and used a little bit of confirm shaming along the way. So if they want to reject the program, they're going to have to affirm that they do not want to protect their data or their credit history, and that's something that people might be psychologically reluctant to affirm. If they said, I do not want to protect my data or credit history, they were going to see one more screen that says, just tell us why you declined. But that screen turns out not to do very much to persuade people who had already rejected the program twice. Okay, what about the aggressive dark patterns condition? Well, they saw at the beginning the same set of screens that people in the mild dark pattern condition saw. So not surprisingly, the results that we generated from the first two screens of mild dark patterns and aggressive dark patterns were quite similar. But then they also, if they rejected the program, and only if they rejected the program on the first few screens, saw some additional obstruction screens. And these screens were designed to really slow them down. It was 3 screens with countdown timers that would require at least 30 seconds to get through, where we gave them information about identity theft, but our goal here wasn't really to persuade them. It was just to make it hurt a little bit if they were going to reject the data protection offer that our hypothetical company was making to them. So they saw basically 3 screens that looked something like this, and then if they declined on all 3 of those screens, then they saw a confusion prompt, like the one I showed you on my second slide at the very beginning of the talk, where there's a little bit of ambiguity as to if they want to reject the program, which of these 2 boxes they're going to want to select. No cancel actually cancels the cancellation, which means it signs them up for the data protection service. And then everyone, regardless of whether they were assigned to the control group, mild dark patterns condition, or aggressive dark pattern condition, saw these same screens at the end, including an open-ended question where they could write anything to the researchers. And then they were fully debriefed and told, in fact, you're not going to be getting a data protection plan. We were researching dark patterns. Don't worry, you haven't been signed up for anything. Okay, so let's now jump into the results. We found that the dark patterns were quite effective at bending consumers to the will of the user interface designer. So you can see that in the control group, only a little bit more than 1 out of every 10 subjects wanted to accept the data protection plan and sign up for it. But even moving to these relatively mild dark patterns, we more than doubled the acceptance rate, and moving to aggressive dark patterns, we more than tripled it. Now there's 2 columns here. There's really 2 different ways to understand the acceptance rate, and I'll explain why that is. We found that in the aggressive dark pattern condition, where we put a lot of dark patterns in front of consumers, quite a number of people dropped out of the experiment. They closed their browser window. And in doing so, they actually forfeited the compensation that they would have been entitled to had they seen the experiment all the way through. In other words, they gave up money, but they just said, oh my gosh, this looks terrible. I'm going to exit right now. Depending on whether you count those people who exited as rejecting the program or as we'll exclude them from the numerator and the denominator, that explains the difference between the higher acceptance rate, this is excluding the dropouts in column 2, versus the lower acceptance rate, which counts the dropouts as having rejected the program. Okay, one of the things I told you was that we randomly varied the price of the dark pattern between almost $9 a month and almost $3 a month. And that turned out to make no difference, no statistically significant difference in response to the higher or lower monthly fee. And I'll show you more data on that from experiment 2 in a little bit. Okay, so from study 1, which are the dark patterns that turned out to be most effective? Well, it was the first ones we showed. Remember the choice between yes and other options, and there was also a recommendation in there. It turns out that of the people who accepted the program, the supermajority did so on one of those first 2 screens. And it's the later screens that accounted for a much lower percentage of the overall acceptances. But we should be careful in interpreting these results. And that's because once people say yes, once people accept the program, they drop out of the experiment. So the people who saw the obstruction screens or the confusing cancellation screens, had already said no to us 2 or 3 or even 4 times. In other words, as you go through experiment 1, you're getting an increasingly resistant population, one that's more resistant. They've already shown they can resist some kinds of dark patterns. And so these results should not be taken as an indication that the first screen was more potent necessarily than the obstruction screens. There's some selection effect for those of you who are interested in line economics and experimental research. And what we'll do in experiment 2 is we'll fix this, this potential selection bias problem. Okay, so one of the things we were particularly interested in, because we had gathered a lot of demographic data, was who's susceptible to dark patterns. And our prediction going in was that dark patterns would be particularly successful with less educated respondents, and that was borne out to be true. Particularly the mild dark patterns. So it is the case that without introducing controls, the dark patterns, whether mild or aggressive, work better on less educated people. But once we controlled for income and other demographics, the effect of the aggressive dark patterns on less educated populations was no longer significant, but the effect of the milder dark patterns on the less educated population remained highly significant. Not only significant, but you can see in terms of the magnitudes of the effect that they're quite large. So the mild dark patterns prompted acceptance among 34% of the less educated population, but only 21% of the more educated population. One of the things that we showed you a little bit ago is that we asked, sort of in the final stages of the experiment, we asked people to assess their mood. We asked them in an open-ended question, do they have any comments for us? What we saw was that people exposed to the aggressive dark pattern rated their mood much worse, and they were much more likely to express anger in the open-ended comment section than people in the control group or the mild dark pattern group. And as I suggested earlier, they're also much more likely to exit the survey without completing it, therefore forfeiting their compensation. Interestingly, though, the mild group looks almost exactly like the control group. There's no statistically significant differences between the two. So that suggests you can use dark patterns, you just can't use too many of them, or you risk a customer backlash. And so I teach at the University of Chicago. We've identified a problem, but at the University of Chicago, we always ask, well, you've identified a problem, but is government intervention, is regulation warranted? And we think that this data about moods, about anger, about willingness to do research with the same researchers again, actually helps shed light on that question. And interestingly, it did seem that the aggressive dark patterns, that regardless of what the law did, there was already a deterrent built into the use of aggressive dark patterns, but there doesn't seem to be a market incentive not to use dark pattern, not to use mild dark patterns. So if we're going to prevent mild dark patterns, it seems as though regulation is likely to be the only mechanism for doing so. There's one other important external validity point, which is a lot of the entities that use dark patterns are entities that have market power. Facebook or Google, sites like that. And in those situations, the use of a dark pattern, even an aggressive dark pattern, may not prompt a huge consumer backlash, because where else are you going to go? If there's only one dominant platform, even if you're angry with what that platform's doing, you don't really have a choice to exit to a similar service provider. And so when we think about what study one tells us, I think the most important takeaway is that it's really the mild dark patterns that seem to give the greatest rise for concern, because there's not an effective consumer backlash, and yet the rewards from employing these techniques seem to already be substantial, and these techniques seem to also prey on the more vulnerable populations, like the less educated. We also thought the dark patterns were just more effective than we expected them to be going in. We expected them to be effective, but were surprised to see doubling and tripling of acceptance rates for what we thought was a pretty dubious product we were offering. Okay, so what study two is going to do, and this is our brand new data that we've just finished crunching all the numbers. What we wanted to do in study two was address some of the shortcomings in the first study. So for one, we just about doubled the size of the subject pool to create more statistical power. And we randomized the order in which people saw dark patterns, so we could isolate which ones were effective and which ones were less effective. We also tried testing some dark patterns that we didn't employ in study one, so that we could cover more of the landscape of the dark patterns that Mathur and Gray and Noen's research teams had previously documented. The other thing we did, and this will be interesting to law and economics audiences, we were just surprised by the lack of any significant difference when we tripled the price of the service. So we said, okay, let's try making this a really bad deal. Let's have the options be not $2.99 and $8.99, but rather $8.99 and $38.99. And that $38.99 figure is way, way higher than any of our competitors charge, the real world competitors charge, for identity theft and data protection plans. It's a terrible deal. And we thought, gee, be surprised if anyone signs up for it when the price is so high. And so one way of understanding what we did is we picked 4 different kinds of form dark patterns, or sorry, 3 different kinds of form dark patterns and 4 different kinds of content dark patterns. And then there was a control group for either. We also oversampled the control group because we wanted to get a very precise estimate of what the control group looked like. But then we randomly assigned our subjects otherwise to any of these different cells. And I'll fill in the data in a second and show you what it looks like. We also added in for fully 1/2 of the sample at the very end a trick question that looked kind of like the yes cancel prompt, and I'll show you what that data looks like, but it employs a slightly different way of phrasing the yes no question. Would you prefer not to decline this free data protection and credit history monitoring? That employs a double negative. Even if you're a native English speaker, you have to think about that language and figure out that if you in fact want to reject the program, you need to select no. You decline, you prefer not to decline rather than yes. And I'll show you what the data in response to that question looks like in just a minute. So if we just break out the content dark patterns, we see that 3 out of the 4 content dark patterns we employed generated statistically significantly higher acceptance rates than the control group did. And in some instances, the effect is huge. So the hidden information prompt, where we put the fact that the program is really only free for the first month and then you're going to be charged for it thereafter. But we put that in fine print, and we put sort of an asterisk by the free offer. That more than doubled the acceptance rates. But even confirm shaming, which is sort of making you feel bad about saying no, or social proof, which suggests that everybody is signing up for the program, those were quite powerful as well, even in this arrangement. Interestingly, the scarcity dark pattern, which was a message that basically said something like, for the next 60 seconds, you have this opportunity to sign up for the program, but the offer is going to disappear if you don't act now. It turns out that dark pattern was completely ineffective, may have even backfired. It generated a slightly lower acceptance rate than the control condition, perhaps indicating that it made us seem cheap or unethical. Consumers have seen so many offers like that it causes them to be perhaps skeptical about whether they should sign up for the good and service. Once we switched over to the form dark patterns, again, 2 out of the 3 turned out to be significantly effective. The mere recommendation alone actually did raise acceptance rates, but not in a way that's significant. But the default, making it selected in advance to sign up for the program, and these obstruction conditions, making you jump through unnecessary hoops in order to say no, those were statistically significant. Obstruction was quite powerful in bending consumers to their will. So this shows you what happens basically with all the different cell assignments. We were interested in studying whether different combinations of dark patterns might work well or less well, and you can see that here. Scarcity seemed to really be a problem, so much so that it even dampened the effect of the very effective, otherwise effective, obstruction dark pattern. But you can see all the cells that are highlighted in yellow represent statistical significance. So scarcity aside, nearly all the dark patterns and combinations of dark patterns proved to be quite effective in getting consumers to sign up. So much so that if you combine, just on a couple screens now, obstruction with hidden information, you can come pretty close to tripling the acceptance rate. What about that trick question? This was another very highly effective dark pattern. It's coming close to doubling the acceptance rate. And what's interesting about the trick question is when at the very end of the experiment, we asked people whether they had in fact signed up or refused the offer. And fully half of the people who agreed to sign up as part of the trick question, the I prefer not to decline, fully half of them misunderstood what they had done. They thought they had rejected the offer when in fact, as a legal matter, they had accepted it. And this is of course highly significant. We also found that the more time people spent on the trick question screen, the less happy they were with us and the less willing they were to agree to follow up research by the same researchers. Okay. In experiment 1, the cost of the service didn't matter. In experiment 2, the cost of the service didn't matter. And not only did we lower the cost of the service, but we also reduced the period of the free trial from 6 months in experiment 1 to 1 month in experiment 2. No statistically significant differences. This is really a shocking finding, in my view, from a law and economics perspective. We can get through whether we might be able to reconcile this finding with rational choice. Maybe, it's possible. We can talk about that if you're interested. But what this tells us, at least in part, is that there's reason to think that these dark patterns can overcome that aspect of consumer decision-making that we ordinarily think of as the most important factor, often the most important factor, which is price. And what accounts for that? Well, we collected some data that indicates that most people think, okay, I'll just sign up for it and then cancel before I start getting charged. Most respondents said they were inclined to do that. 21% of respondents said they would definitely do this. And we have reason to believe from looking at industry data that this reflects optimistic bias on the part of consumers. And so a lot of consumers will get charged once, twice, maybe forever, if they do in fact sign up for these free trials. Okay, some of the dark patterns significantly affected people's moods. You can see that on the slide. I won't belabor it. But what's interesting is, consistent with study one's effectiveness of mild dark patterns, in general, in study two, where pretty much everyone was seeing a mild dark pattern, their mood was not adversely affected. So we think of this as largely replicating the study one result. Another result that we replicated is the education effects. Here in the control group, less educated people were less likely to sign up for the service. We think part of that is driven by the timing. We launched this research in late February, early March of 2020. The pandemic was just starting to hit the United States at that point, and lockdowns were beginning. People were beginning to lose jobs. We think that accounts for what's going on in column two. But again, the effect of the dark pattern is much more potent on less educated people than it is on highly educated people. So you can see the dark patterns doing much more work with that group than with highly educated people. Just a few more slides, and then where I talk a little bit about the law, and then I'd like to open things up for questions. So if you have questions, please start thinking about them now, and I believe you'll be able to use the raise hand feature to go ahead and get your questions in the queue. So there's a lot of interesting legal implications from this research. We think of sort of this question about what to do about mild dark patterns as maybe the most interesting. And we think that this research also raises questions about what the law means when it refers to people consenting. By and large, a lot of the dark patterns, at least under US law, would be consistent with how courts would understand consumer consent. And we think there might be reasons to revise our concept of consent, at least where dark patterns are employed. Now, there are some provisions in US law, like the Federal Trade Commission Act or the Restore Online Shoppers Confidence Act, that potentially could be tools to use against the most aggressive dark patterns. And indeed, just last week, the Federal Trade Commission here in the United States instituted an enforcement action against a firm that was employing a series of dark patterns in a website that offers educational services to children and their families. And they used the language of dark patterns. So our trade regulator is getting increasingly interested in these kinds of techniques. And in the paper version of this talk, we also get into versions of the law, and especially the second restatement of consumer contracts that talk about undue influence or unfair persuasion. We think that some of these dark pattern techniques are so powerful that they might constitute undue influence and thereby render consumer consent voidable. And within European Union competition law, there are similar kinds of doctrines, most notably Directive 2005/29 of the European Parliament and the European Council, Articles 8 and 9, that prohibit these commercial practices that significantly impair the consumer's freedom of action, imposing disproportionate non-contractual barriers, kind of like the obstruction technique or like some of the confusion tactics that I showed you earlier. The GDPR, which has of course become the basis for so many countries' privacy regulation regimes, also has provisions like privacy by design and privacy by default and a heightened standard of consent that might make some of these dark patterns unlawful when used to try to extract personal information from consumers. But remember that while the GDPR is very broad in some respects, it does not apply typically to ordinary consumer actions to buy and sell goods. And so GDPR is broad in one sense, but only narrow in that it generally will apply to data controllers, but not necessarily to people who are just trying to sell you stuff without trying to collect your personal information. Finally, we think of nagging as maybe the biggest gap in global legal regimes. Nagging turns out to be quite effective, we think. That's, remember, the choice between okay and maybe later. Our data is highly suggestive of that. And yet, we don't generally have legal regimes that prevent you from repeatedly asking individuals to sign up for services and then only take yes for an answer and not take no for an answer. There's some bodies of sexual harassment law that do that, but in the consumer contracts context, we don't have a lot of law that tries to clamp down on nagging. This talk is also a paper, and that paper should be published in the next month or so at the Journal of Legal Analysis. You can freely download the final version of the paper once it's out. And in the meantime, if you're interested in seeing all the data, at least for experiment 1, you can freely download a paper that is the basis for the talk on the ssrn.com website. And here's the place you can download it. I'll make all these slides available after the talk, so don't feel the need to jot any of this down, or you can just use a search engine to find Shining a Light on Dark Patterns. You should locate it easily. So thank you so much for listening. I'm really excited about hearing your questions, and I'll end the screen sharing and look forward to hearing from you.
Hi. Hi, Lior. How are you?
I'm great. How are you? Good to see you, Shin.
Good to see you, Lior, and good to see you, Omri, and others people. Really apologize, everyone, and good morning or good evening. I'm Shin Dai from Peking University Law School. Omri very kindly asked me to moderate the lecture today and introduce the speaker, Professor Strahilevitz, but a Zoom glitch actually prevented me from getting in the beginning. I think I got blocked out from the Zoom meeting room, even though on the screen I was staring at continued to tell me to wait for the meeting to start. So I think that's very deceptive, although that doesn't have to count as a dark pattern, I think. So I think despite the risk of Zoom glitch, the first thing I would like to say is I myself is really thrilled that the Coase-Sandor Institute is doing such a great service to academics around the world, as well as to the general public, by offering the Global Lecture Series. Everybody has seen, so today's talk, I got in actually 5 minutes, I think, into the talk, so I got the chance to enjoy the rest of it. It's really wonderful, and I'm really excited about listening to the rest of the speakers, and also their really cutting edge work. So thank you, Omri, a lot for this. I would also like to say a little bit more before we get back to the presentation. I think because I thought that's the kind of duty Omri gave me to introduce Lior, but I must have to do a little bit. So I think besides his stellar reputation as a scholar, I think Lior in Chicago is also known by students throughout the years as one of the most generous and helpful mentor you can ever find on campus. So I'm saying this or mentioning this because coincidentally today, September 10th, is actually the Teachers' Day in China, which is a day on which everybody pays tribute to the teachers and mentors we all have in our lives who have guided us through our process of development. So I'm a teacher myself. I got a lot of thank you notes from my students, but I think one of my own must go to Lior. So I'm just sending one now virtually, which I think is the efficient way. It's a Chicago way. Also, another to Omri, and also, of course, to other great professors I had the privilege of having back in Chicago. So back to the presentation. I think anyone who's actually read Lior's work, even just any one piece from a long list, I think you'll find them consistently original, innovative, and very thought-provoking, just like this present one. I think all of us have our own stories encountering or even falling for something like a dark pattern. I got this kind of experience even last week, even though I had read Lior's paper, I think a year ago. So that's kind of embarrassing, but also shows how powerful this kind of things could be. But I think what's really exciting about the work here is that through a meticulously designed experimental research, and Lior and his collaborator really go beyond the anecdotes that every one of us have, and offer us a systematic look into the problem, the effectiveness of the tricks. I think that, of course, opened doors to more serious and nuanced deliberation about potential reactions from legal regulatory perspectives. So I think we would, of course, open up to Q&A, but before that, I would just grasp the privilege and ask a few questions of my own, because I do have a lot of questions. This is really interesting work, but I'll just try to ask only, I think, two. So the first question would be about this paper or this research focus on effectiveness of dark pattern tricks, right? I think as a matter of empirical exploration, it's really fascinating that we certainly want to know how much these tricks work and which among them work more than others, right? So of course, that's very interesting, important question empirically or scientifically. But I think from a legal perspective, I think the paper is really intending to problematize the dark patterns as a general category or concept that courts or regulators could look into. But then, I think whether as lawyers, we really need to worry very much about the level of effectiveness here. I guess maybe there's another angle to think about it. So the reason I ask this is, I think one angle to look into this is all these tricks we can normatively say they're not efficient, right? Irrespective of whether they work or they don't work as well. I guess for those, for example, those dark pattern tricks, tactics that work is an inefficient transfer of wealth because people bought things they don't want, right? So, but for those tricks that don't work, that's even more wasteful investment in attempt at inefficient transfer, right? So either they work or they don't work. I mean, they're not efficient or they're not social welfare maximizing. So if that's the case, maybe I'm just guessing, maybe what the regulators could do very well just to generally or across the board steer firms away from such attempts, right? So whether they're effective or not effective, we don't need to spend a lot of time disputing them. Maybe, just especially litigating them, as a matter of fact in courts. So I think again, the question then boils down to just making sure that we define well what's a dark pattern. As whenever we see it, we just knock it down, right? So I wonder whether Lior agree with this. Kind of state, this kind of line of thinking, or you think there might be some problem in it or something I'm missing. So the second question or second group of question would be the sort of a Chicago question about, what if I don't believe market will ever fail, that line of thinking. But I think here, I think market will fail, but I still just want to ask this kind of question. So I guess I'm wondering, maybe that's beyond the scope of this paper, but why isn't there enough market checks on the use of dark patterns? I guess we individual consumers, like myself, we may be hapless in ourselves, but there are other actors, I think, that may be able to do something in the market, right? So one type of plausible market checks could come from, I guess, consumer protection technologies that some firms may have incentives to develop, right? For example, you may find someone write up a plugin or extension to a browser that will identify dark patterns and warn you about it when you get on, say, Amazon or other online shopping platforms. So, so that might be useful. I guess some issues may arise under current law as these plugins may be deemed as unfair competition or even criminal offenses in some jurisdictions, right? Computer crimes, right? Under Chinese law, for example, that's pretty much the case already. These plugins or extensions will be, in a lot of cases, were deemed illegal. In U.S. law, as I understand, this can be murky, but not so stringent as China. But do you think that that kind of thing might be effective? That kind of market checks might be effective. If not, why we don't see them, right? So the second type of market checks might coming from competing firms or platforms, right? So what about we see some platforms, maybe they just make a statement to say, okay, look, other platform, they will use dark patterns to trick you, but we don't. So come over, shop with us, right? So why don't we do this? Because I think there are definitely, some platforms that should do this. So why that's not a good strategy for many? Or I guess even relatedly, just for regulation, what about some of the more market-based type regulation, for example, disclosure, which Omri particularly dislikes. For example, why don't we just ask platforms to make a statement, just like cigarettes, sellers, just to warn shoppers, okay, whenever you get on, beware, there are dark patterns on our websites. So, you should be very careful when shopping with us, stuff like that, right? So if we make them do this, what could be bad about it, right? So I guess one, maybe the shopping experience may be less enjoyable, but still, I guess on the other hand, you do have a more reliable way to satisfy your, your preference in terms of what kind of good you get, right? So I'm also wondering, why don't you? So just in general, why don't you think we don't have these? Why do you think we don't see many of these market checks coming up? And why do you think a more centralized way of regulation might be a better solution? So I guess that could be the question for many. So I'll just stop here, and maybe if you want, you can respond a little, and while we accumulate a queue of questions from other people. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shin, for those comments. Most importantly, thank you for those really very generous and kind words. It was such a joy to work with you as a student at Chicago, and I take so much happiness and pride in all your accomplishments since leaving. So thank you very much. Let me sort of briefly address, I think, the main points. There's so much there. I think one way that I understand dark patterns is that some of these techniques, particularly hidden information or obstruction, are so potent that they're essentially as effective as lying. And every developed country has rules against fraud in the consumer marketplace. And if this is as effective as fraud, then there ought to be rules in place. On the other hand, I do think that what our data shows with respect to scarcity messages, for example, is consumers do learn there are some kinds of techniques that are transparent enough to where consumers will build up self-defense mechanisms. And if that's the case, we certainly don't need legal intervention there. But things like hidden information, there are already maybe some laws that get at that in different regimes. Obstruction, there's very little law. Some of these other techniques that are quite potent, trick questions, the law can be a little bit murky. There's a lot of gray areas. So what we're proposing, and this won't be the only study that tries to use these techniques, it was just the first, is a very data-driven approach to regulation. Let's see which kinds of dark patterns are most effective, and let's focus our regulatory effort on them, not on dark patterns that maybe don't accomplish that much and don't mislead that many consumers or don't cause that many consumers to experience regret. One of the things that we did in gathering this data is we looked at, okay, well, who's annoyed by dark patterns, or who's experiencing regret after signing up for the service. We tried that series of questions in experiment 2. And what we find is that the people who said no, the people who rejected the dark patterns, were the only ones whose moods were worse. The people who said yes in response to the dark pattern, they were happy. They were willing to do other research. They had been successfully manipulated without really knowing that they had been manipulated, or at least without holding any grudges about that. And I think someone put this in the comments section, certainly there's going to be some people who will see through dark patterns. Certainly a disclosure might reach some people, but most people are just going to, quickly glance past that text without reading it and internalizing it. But the problem with dark patterns is kind of the insidious nature of the techniques. Sales techniques, there have always been sales techniques that are manipulative. That's, that goes back thousands of years. What's dangerous about dark patterns is that companies are routinely doing exactly the kind of experimentation that Jamie and I are doing. They're figuring out exactly what works. Maybe they're starting to personalize these dark patterns and figure out what works on what kinds of consumers. And then they're weaponizing these things. They're employing the dark patterns that work most effectively against the kinds of consumers who are going to be most vulnerable to them. And that's just an arms race that consumers can't hope to catch up in. I do think if dark patterns became very salient, you might see the same kind of market competition. One firm saying, we don't do dark patterns, come use our product. Maybe in the long run, it's possible that we'll get there. I think it takes so much effort to raise concerns about dark patterns. And right now we're only, at the beginning of helping to educate consumers about how to protect themselves. So there is a strategy that says, well, maybe wait 10 years, the situation will be so bad that we won't need regulation. Well, that's a lot of consumer welfare losses in 10 years. And there's no guarantee even that these techniques will be something consumers can adequately protect themselves against, because remember, this is a fast-moving industry, and they're regularly dreaming up new ways to get consumers to part with their cash. So thank you. There's a lot of other questions, so I think I have more to say about what Xin asked, but I'll hold off for now. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So now I'll just call up the queue. Unmute the questioner. So first will be. So I guess let's accumulate a few questions before Lior respond. So first, please, Yongchen.
Hi, Lior. What a great paper.
Great to see you.
Great to see you. I think one big difference between your scholarship and mine is that when I talked my scholarship with my wife, she fell asleep. When I talked your scholarship with her, she wanted to know more. And this is like a very good example. So I have two questions. One, we do have some real world, like offline dark patterns, like nagging. Someone keep asking you whether you want to buy this product or not. But we don't see all kinds of dark patterns online in an offline world. I guess we all have like commonsensical way to say why we do and don't have such kind of dark patterns. But I think if you can flash out like more theoretically why we do see some kind of dark patterns online, but not offline, we know better why people in a virtual world got tricked more easily. And second question, I was kind of shocked when you told us that like these 5,000 people have bought this or kind of fake randomly generated numbers, but this would like constitute misrepresentation or fraud in contract law. But they can easily use real data. Like I think like in Booking.com or kind of Hotel.com, we see it all the time. Like 3 people are watching this like room right now. 7 people like booked it. They could be real. And like for like limited and different product like the hotel rooms, you could easily like just jump on it because 3 persons have just reserved this room. So if they use real number, then a lot of the legal instrument you wanted to address this dark patterns will not be useful, at least under current law. So how would you do when they started to use real number and even use like a machine learning way to tailor-made different kinds of dark patterns on people based on their prior behavior, such as, oh, you didn't go to your last baseball games. You want to buy insurance now? Something like that. That's my 2 questions. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Yongchen. Next one in line is Cheng Wu. So can I ask everybody to, when you ask a question, please be a little bit brief. Thank you.
Hi, Professor. Could you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you great. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. I have 2 questions. The first one is about the fee, because from your result, it seems that it doesn't show significant about the fee. But I want to confirm that do they really know that they should pay for the fee, or they just know that this price is just showed during the experiment? Because it seems unreasonable for me to know that they don't care about the fee. And the second question is about one of your statements that mind the dark patterns that are most insidious. I'm wondering about this statement because I feel that under the mind dark pattern allows the sellers try to sell their products and service, and also permit consumers to reject without much burden as well. So it seems that burden is not so bad, at least for me. But would you please explain your reasons that characterize this pattern as insidious? And also it reminds me about the price discrimination offline, because we permit the price discrimination, and it sounds like such discrimination online. So I feel that I don't understand why this is so unacceptable. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So I guess let's just get one more questioner. What about Mr. Jake Linford?
Hi, Lior. Fantastic project.
Hi, Jay. Great to see you.
Good to see you too. I kind of wanted to ask a little more about Shindai's question about the arms race question, right? You know, it seems to be one approach is you let the firms kind of figure out what works, and we figure out what works, and we kind of continually have an arms race where we're trying to find the dark patterns we don't like. Would we be better off to just say, look, let's set some standards for choice architecture, and we're going to tell you these are paths we don't want you to go down from a regulatory standpoint? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, Lior, would you want to respond to the question from the three members of the audience?
Sure. So I'll go in order. So starting with Yunjian, you know, here's I think something that's worth remembering. The equivalent of dark patterns do exist in the offline world. So think about how casinos are designed. There's lots of attractive lights to try and keep you at the machines. There's various things that they'll do in the architecture to try and guide you towards the parts of the casino where the house makes more money and where the consumer is more likely to move. And the exits are typically very difficult to locate in a casino. That's a lot like dark patterns. The challenge is that if the casino's research suggests that they want to employ something different in terms of the physical space, it's very difficult and very costly to knock down walls. It's very difficult to suddenly, you know, completely change the look of the machines because there's sort of real and personal property there that's somewhat fixed in its nature. And imagine if a casino could constantly be tweaked, the physical layout of the casino could constantly be tweaked. Imagine if the casino was constantly monitoring all of its thousands of consumers and could make in real time changes to the layout of the casino, the look of the poker tables, et cetera. That's essentially what's happening in the online world. And so it's not that there's a difference in kind between manipulation in the real world and manipulation online. It's that there's a difference in magnitude and that the cost of experimentation online is essentially zero. And that makes it, in my view, a different kind of threat, but not necessarily conceptually different kind of threat to what we see in the real world. I do think personalization and dark patterns is not something we've tested in this paper. It's a limit of the project. I do think that's clearly the direction that firms are heading, and that presents additional challenges that don't exist, not to nearly the same degree in the offline world. So you go into a clothing store, unless the salesperson happens to know you and know your vulnerabilities, they're just going to make judgments based on, you know, your age, your gender, how you're dressed. But imagine all of a sudden that you walk into a clothing store and the salesperson has a perfect profile of all of your attributes and all your vulnerabilities. Increasingly, at least on websites where consumers are spending a lot of their time, we might see a sort of manipulative force that looks like that. And personalization certainly, I think, enhances the threat of dark patterns. Ching's question, I think there are a bunch of interesting ones. I'm just gonna, because there's other questions, I'm gonna highlight the sort of, did consumers know that they were going to be charged aspect of her question. So we did the best we could on that. So I'll tell you what we did in experiment one. In experiment one, we collected people's cell phone numbers. We collected their IP addresses, or at least we told them we were collecting their IP addresses. We told them we collected their zip codes. And what we said in experiment one is, based on the information you've already given us, including your cell phone number, we can uniquely identify you and sign you up for this service. We didn't actually have their credit cards. We didn't ask them for their credit cards. We wouldn't have really been able to get approval from our IRB, our Institutional Review Board, in order to do that kind of experiment. And frankly, I wouldn't have wanted to alarm consumers to that degree by collecting their credit card information. But I will tell you from the open-ended comments that a lot of people felt that they were being charged and they were really angry with us. So in the aggressive dark patterns condition, about 13% of people expressed anger in the open-ended comment form, and some of those were, you know, suggestions that we kill ourselves in creative ways. So at least some people really bought that we were about to start charging them for this service after the trial period ended, and they were upset about it Whether everyone believed it, I'm not sure. In the second experiment, we didn't collect cell phone information, but we did collect information about the subject's credit card issuers and their banks. Again, we didn't get routing numbers or anything like that. But we were trying to make it as convincing as possible that this was in fact an actual transaction that was going to take place. And again, there's a reason from the qualitative data that we gathered to believe that lots of consumers in fact expected that they would be charged at the end of the trial period. But we can't do the experiment quite the same way that Facebook or Amazon can, or any entity that actually has credit card numbers. Jake's question about how to think about a regulatory strategy, I think is a really good one. There is some, I've talked to our own Federal Trade Commission a couple of times about dark patterns. There, I think, is some interest within the trade regulator in the United States, at least, to try to create a set of industry standards. The FTC really wanted to see the kind of data that we're presenting, especially in the final published version of this paper, because they really sort of wanted some guidance about which kinds of dark patterns to emphasize in their enforcement strategies. And our approach, which maybe it's not the right approach, but I think it's ours, is figure out which dark patterns are most harmful and focus on those. And we think, based on our results, the trade regulators are in a much better position to do that. So I agree. I think you can certainly think about ways to create standards that maybe put particular strategies off limits. Or another thing you can say is dark patterns that are going to reach a particular threshold for effectiveness are going to be presumptively unlawful, right? So you can use data like ours, and this won't be the only study. This hopefully there'll be lots more that use similar techniques. You can use data like ours to try to identify the most pernicious dark patterns, and then where you identify a dark pattern that's quantitatively quite effective, you can then shift the burden back to the company that's employing them to try to provide a sensible, sound explanation for why they're doing it. Sometimes companies create confusing user interfaces by mistake, and that shouldn't be unlawful. But when they create intentionally confusing dark patterns, then that's a problem. And you can use some data to perhaps help identify those that are more likely to be the cause of confusion versus those that are most likely to be products of intentional manipulation. So thanks for all three of those great questions.
Okay, thank you. I was just getting permission for one more question, and we need to finish within 5 minutes. So let's go to John Foppert. Mr. Foppert?
Yeah, great. Hey, I just wanted to take the bait and see if you would offer the rational choice interpretation of spending $39 a month on a service that's otherwise available for a quarter of that.
Okay, sure. So this might be this is an explanation I don't buy, but I think if someone was had a sort of religious fervor about rational choice theory, I think this is what they would say. They would say, well, what you're doing when you provide both a free trial and a particular price, the price is signaling how valuable the service is that's being provided during the free trial. So in other words, let's take the experiment one, the $2.99 versus the $8.99 service. I think a rational choice person would say, and this strikes me as plausible at that level of pricing, gee, they're offering me this free service for 6 months. That's great, but really it's only a $2.99 service. So maybe it's not such a high quality service. An $8.99 service, gee, I don't like the idea of paying more eventually, but I guess it's a higher quality service because it's a more expensive service. So you can imagine those two factors canceling out. On the one hand, price is something, high price means I have to pay more. On the other hand, there's a signal that's sent there about how much the free trial that I'm signing up for is worth. And if I'm sure that I'm going to cancel the free trial, then the price really doesn't move me. Now, once we go to experiment 2 and we're providing something that's clearly way above the market price for data protection services, that I think probably weakens the rational choice explanation for what may arise. It doesn't dampen it. I mean, the same logic might still apply. And maybe consumers are completely ignorant about how much this should cost. But at least to me, even accepting some value in the sort of rational choice signaling story, there's lots of reason to be concerned that some of these dark patterns overcome the sort of baseline behavior of the rational consumer, where price, generally looms really large in consumer decision making. And we think it's necessary for the economy to be efficient, for price to be a really important factor in motivating consumers. So I do think there's a really interesting puzzle here. I'd love to see more follow-up work. We may do more follow-up work, but replicating the original result in experiment 2 with the 3899 group, boy, I mean, that's a result that jumps off the page to me.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much, Lior. Great responses to a group of great questions. I think we're really need to finish here, so I'm handing it back to Omri. Omri.
Thank you, Shin, for joining us and for such a great moderation. Thank you, Lior, for a fantastic lecture that kept us all captivated. I heard it before, but I enjoyed so much hearing it again. Let me just say, in wrapping up, that I think what Lior's lecture, when I originally read this paper, did to me, is inspired me to think about a whole new category of problems in consumer markets, and that is the problem of manipulation. In what way is it different from deception, and how to deal with it? It is challenging because while we can know it when we see it, and dark patterns, especially the harsh ones, are so obviously wrong, it's hard to draw a line as to what is manipulation and what is not. Because so much of advertising, if not all of advertising, is manipulative. So much of product shelf placement in supermarkets is manipulative. So many of the things, the ways products are designed to get people addicted to the service and to the network is in a way manipulative. People don't know what is being done to them, and that in some ways their choices are being directed and limited and constrained. And yet we are not ready to prohibit all of the tactics employed in the markets. So this is kind of a call for researchers and for thinkers to figure out how to draw a line around what is prohibited and what should not be prohibited, what is manipulative and illegal, and what is manipulative and part of life. I'll just add to say that in some of my ongoing work, I have taken that challenge and working with Oren Bargil to try to develop such boundaries around illegal manipulation. We now have to end this lecture. Thank you everyone for joining us. Before I do, let me make a quick announcement. We have a lot of excellent lectures lined up. I'm not sure we'll be able to match this one, but we will do our best. Part of this global lecture series, we will have 4 more, and the next one will be by our colleague Daniel Hamill, who will discuss on Monday at the same time the issue of innovation incentives during COVID-19 pandemic. Separately, the Coase-Sandor Institute is currently organizing another set of global lectures, this one done in collaboration with the FGV universities in Brazil. And it is the next lecture in that series is also posted online and would be very interesting next Tuesday at an hour that might not be very convenient for people in Asia, but very convenient for the rest of the world. Professor Adam Chilton, our colleague, will talk about his book on why constitutional rights don't matter. So if you want to be challenged on that respect as well, please join us and find the information on the Coase-Sandor Institute website. With that, I am delighted that you joined us, and we are ending the meeting. Thank you, everybody, and have a good day or good night.